The evening of April 22nd, 1947, was warm in Harlem, with temperatures in the mid-60s and clear skies as the sun set around 7:30. Lenox Avenue was busy with people finishing work, shopping for dinner, and beginning their evening activities. The sidewalks were crowded with residents who knew each other, who greeted each other as they passed, and who understood the social networks that connected the neighborhood. Mabel Johnson was 53 years old in April 1947 and had lived in Harlem since 1915. Mabel had provided a home for her younger brother, Bumpy, when he arrived from Charleston in 1919 at age 14, and she had watched him grow from an angry teenager into one of Harlem's most powerful figures over the following 28 years. Mabel lived a quiet life, working as a seamstress and attending church regularly at Abyssinian Baptist Church on West 138th Street. Mabel was respected in the neighborhood as a hard-working, dignified woman who minded her own business and treated everyone courteously. On the evening of April 22nd, Mabel was walking north on Lenox Avenue near 132nd Street, returning home after purchasing groceries at a market several blocks south. Mabel carried 2 cloth shopping bags containing vegetables, bread, and other items for the week. Mabel walked at a steady pace, occasionally nodding to people she recognized. As Mabel approached the corner of Lenox Avenue and 132nd Street, a man emerged from a building entrance directly in front of her, forcing Mabel to stop abruptly to avoid collision. The man was approximately 45 years old, white, wearing an expensive dark suit and polished shoes that indicated wealth. The man looked directly at Mabel with an expression that conveyed not accidental collision, but deliberate obstruction. The man's gaze moved slowly from Mabel's face down to her feet and back up, a visual inspection that was deliberately disrespectful and that communicated that he considered Mabel to be someone whose presence was subject to his evaluation. The man smiled slightly, a smile that showed contempt rather than friendliness. Then the man made a gesture, a small motion with his hand near his face that suggested he was adjusting his hat, but that Mabel understood was meant to mock her appearance or her station. The interaction lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Approximately 20 people were on that section of sidewalk, close enough to observe what occurred. Expression did not change. Mabel did not change. Mabel did not speak, did not stop to confront the man, and did not show any emotional reaction. Mabel simply stepped to the side, walked around the man, and continued north on Lenox Avenue toward her home. Mabel understood that responding to public disrespect from a white man could create dangers. Police might be called, accusations might be made, and a black woman who objected to disrespectful treatment could face serious consequences. The white man watched Mabel walk away, apparently satisfied that his gesture of disrespect had achieved its purpose. And the man then entered a car that was parked at the curb, a new Cadillac sedan with a driver waiting, and the car drove away south on Lenox Avenue. The witnesses to this interaction included Marcus Williams, who operated a newsstand on the corner of Lenox and 132nd. Williams knew Mabel as Bumpy Johnson's sister and understood immediately that what he had just witnessed would be reported to Johnson. Williams also recognized the white man as someone who had been seen in Harlem occasionally over the previous several months, always arriving by car, always dressed expensively, and always carrying himself with the arrogance of someone who believed his wealth and race entitled him to treat others with contempt. By 8:30 that evening, approximately 1 hour after the incident, Marcus Williams had sent word to Johnson about what had occurred. Williams provided specific details: the time, the location, the man's appearance, the deliberate nature of the disrespect, the fact that it had occurred in public view of multiple witnesses, and the description of the Cadillac that had driven away. Johnson was 41 years old in April 1947 and had been operating in Harlem's criminal economy for 28 years. Johnson had worked for Stephanie St. Clair in the early 1930s, had fought Dutch Schultz from 1933 to 1935, had negotiated the agreement with Lucky Luciano in 1935 that established relative autonomy for Harlem's operations, and had built a sophisticated organization that controlled gambling, provided protection services, and maintained order in the neighborhood. Johnson's reputation included being someone who defended family and community members from disrespect, particularly from outsiders who believed they could treat Harlem residents with contempt. Johnson received Williams's report while meeting with associates at an office above a restaurant on Lenox Avenue. Johnson listened carefully to the description of what had occurred and asked several specific questions. Had the man's behavior been accidental or deliberate? How had Mabel responded? Who else had witnessed the interaction? Had the man been seen in Harlem before? What kind of car had he been driving? Williams answered each question. The behavior had been clearly deliberate. The man had positioned himself to block Mabel's path and had examined her in a way that communicated disrespect. Mabel had not responded, but had simply walked away with dignity. Approximately 20 people had witnessed the interaction, including Williams and several others who knew Mabel was Johnson's sister. The man had been seen in Harlem multiple times over recent months. The car was a new black Cadillac sedan with a driver. Johnson sat quietly for several minutes after Williams finished his report. Johnson understood that what had occurred on Lenox Avenue required a response, but Johnson also understood that the response needed to be calculated carefully. Immediate violence would satisfy personal anger, but would create problems. Police attention, potential retaliation from whatever organization the white man represented, and risks to Johnson's operations. What was needed was investigation to understand who the man was and why he felt entitled to disrespect women in Harlem, followed by a systematic response that would destroy the man's position and safety while demonstrating to others that such disrespect carried devastating consequences. Between April 22nd and April 27th, a period of 5 days, Johnson conducted detailed investigation into the white man's identity and activities. This investigation required resources and contacts throughout New York City. By April 27th, Johnson had assembled a comprehensive profile. The man's name was Vincent Moretti. Moretti was 46 years old and was a soldier in the Lucchese crime family, one of New York's 5 families. Moretti's primary operations involved loan sharking and illegal gambling in Queens and parts of Manhattan outside Harlem. But Moretti had been coming to Harlem over the previous 6 months, attempting to establish loan sharking operations by offering credit to business owners at rates lower than what Johnson's organization charged. Moretti believed that his connection to the Lucchese family would protect him from interference, and that Harlem residents would accept his operations because of the lower interest rates. Moretti's disrespect toward Mabel reflected his general attitude toward black residents of Harlem. Moretti viewed them as potential customers to be exploited and as people whose dignity was irrelevant. Moretti had been observed making similar disrespectful gestures toward other black women and had been heard making contemptuous comments about black residents to his associates. Johnson understood from this investigation that Moretti's disrespect toward Mabel was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of contempt. Johnson also understood that Moretti's presence in Harlem, attempting to establish loan sharking operations, represented a challenge to Johnson's authority and a violation of the territorial boundaries that had been established through the 1935 agreement with Luciano. Johnson made a decision. Johnson would respond to Moretti's disrespect by systematically destroying Moretti's operations, his reputation within the Lucchese family, his safety, and ultimately his physical capability to continue operating. This response would require multiple components executed over several weeks, building pressure that would leave Moretti isolated and vulnerable. And between April 28th and May 20th, a period of approximately 3 weeks, Johnson organized and executed a comprehensive campaign against Vincent Moretti. The campaign had 6 components. The first component was eliminating Moretti's Harlem operations. Johnson identified every business owner to whom Moretti had offered loans and every person who had accepted Moretti's credit. Johnson met personally or sent trusted associates to meet with each of these individuals and explained that accepting loans from Moretti was a violation of community agreements, that Moretti's operations would be shut down, and that anyone who continued dealing with Moretti would face consequences. Johnson offered to refinance loans at terms comparable to what Moretti had offered, removing any financial incentive to continue working with Moretti. Within 1 week, every person who had been dealing with Moretti stopped making payments and stopped accepting credit. The second component was making Moretti's continued presence in Harlem physically dangerous. Johnson assigned associates to follow Moretti whenever he entered Harlem, making their surveillance obvious. Moretti would see the same men on every street corner, would notice cars following his Cadillac, and would understand that his movements were being tracked continuously. Johnson also arranged for Moretti to receive indirect warnings, messages delivered through intermediaries stating that his presence in Harlem was unwelcome and that he should cease operations. The third component was communicating with the Lucchese family leadership about Moretti's activities. Johnson sent word through Frank Costello, who maintained relationships with leaders of all 5 families, that one of the Lucchese family's soldiers was operating in Harlem without authorization, was violating territorial agreements, and was showing disrespect to residents, including Johnson's family members. Johnson stated that this situation required resolution through proper channels, but that if the Lucchese family did not address it, Johnson would handle it directly. The fourth component was documenting Moretti's other activities for use in creating problems with law enforcement. Johnson's associates gathered information about Moretti's loan sharking operations in Queens, including names of customers, amounts loaned, interest rates charged, and methods of collection. This information was provided anonymously to police officers in Queens who were not on Moretti's payroll, creating law enforcement pressure on Moretti's primary operations. The fifth component was spreading information about Moretti's disrespect within the Italian organized crime community. Johnson arranged for word to reach other mob figures that Moretti had publicly disrespected the sister of the godfather of Harlem, that Moretti was operating in Harlem without proper authorization, and that Moretti's behavior was creating conflict that violated long-standing agreements. This information damaged Moretti's reputation and created doubt among his associates about whether Moretti was reliable. The sixth component was preparing for violence, if necessary. Johnson assigned 3 men to track Moretti's routines outside Harlem, where Moretti lived in Queens, what routes he took, where he conducted business, when he was most vulnerable. And this surveillance was preparation for direct action. If Moretti did not respond appropriately to the other pressures, these 6 components operated simultaneously throughout early May. By May 15th, Moretti was experiencing severe problems. His Harlem operations had completely collapsed with 0 remaining customers. His movements in Harlem were tracked constantly, making him fearful about his safety. The Lucchese family leadership had questioned him about his unauthorized operations and his creation of conflict with Johnson. His operations in Queens were under investigation by police. His reputation among other mob figures was damaged. He understood that men were tracking his movements and preparing for something worse. On May 17th, Moretti attempted to reassert his position by returning to Harlem with 4 associates, apparently intending to demonstrate that he would not be intimidated. Moretti's Cadillac drove to a location on Lenox Avenue, where Moretti had previously met with business owners. Moretti and his associates emerged from the car and entered a restaurant. Within minutes, approximately 15 of Johnson's associates had surrounded the restaurant. When Moretti and his group emerged 30 minutes later, they found themselves facing a much larger force. No violence occurred at that moment. Moretti and his men simply got back in their car and left. But the message was clear. Moretti could not operate safely in Harlem, regardless of how many men he brought. By May 20th, the Lucchese family leadership had made a decision about Moretti. Would recall Moretti from any activities in Harlem. Johnson accepted this resolution with the understanding that if Moretti entered Harlem again, Johnson would handle the situation directly without involving the Lucchese leadership. Moretti was informed by his own organization that his Harlem operations were terminated and that he was to stay out of the neighborhood permanently. Moretti's standing within the Lucchese family had been damaged by the investigation, the conflict with Johnson, and the revelation that he had been operating without proper authorization. Moretti had gone from being a successful loan shark to being someone whose judgment was questioned and whose future advancement was uncertain. The systematic campaign had taken approximately 3 weeks and had destroyed Moretti's Harlem operations, damaged his reputation, created problems with his own organization, and established that his presence in Harlem would trigger immediate confrontation. But Johnson understood that Moretti's disrespect toward Mabel required more than just professional consequences. It required personal consequences that would be visible and that would serve as a permanent warning to others. On the night of June 3, 1947, 6 weeks after Moretti had disrespected Mabel on Lenox Avenue, Moretti was leaving a bar in Queens where he had been drinking with 2 associates. It was approximately 1:30 in the morning. Moretti was walking to his car when 3 men approached from different directions. The men wore dark clothing and had their faces partially covered. What occurred next took less than 2 minutes. The three men attacked Moretti with extreme violence focused specifically on his face. Moretti's associates attempted to intervene, but were held back by two additional men who appeared from a nearby alley. By the time the attack ended, Moretti had sustained severe injuries to his face and eyes from repeated blows. The attackers left immediately, disappearing into the Queens streets. Moretti was taken to a hospital where doctors worked to save his vision. The injuries were so severe that Moretti lost vision in both eyes, one completely and permanently, the other partially and with permanent damage. Moretti would never see normally again. No arrests were ever made in connection with the attack. Police investigated, but found no witnesses willing to provide useful information and no physical evidence that led to suspects. Within the organized crime community, the attack was understood to be connected to Moretti's disrespect toward Johnson's sister and his unauthorized operations in Harlem, though no one stated this publicly. The resolution of Vincent Moretti's situation created effects that extended far beyond one man's injuries. The demonstration that disrespecting Johnson's family members would trigger not just professional consequences, but personal violence sent a clear message throughout New York's organized crime community. The demonstration that Johnson could sustain pressure over weeks while preparing for violent resolution if necessary reinforced perceptions that Johnson was both patient and ruthless. The systematic dismantling of Moretti's operations before the violence occurred illustrated strategic sophistication. Johnson had not reacted impulsively, but had methodically destroyed Moretti's position, isolated him from support, and only then arranged for violence to occur. This sequence demonstrated that violence was most effective when the target had already been weakened and isolated, rather than when they were strong and protected. The involvement of the Lucchese family leadership in resolving the situation through official channels before the violence occurred provided Johnson with some protection from retaliation. The Lucchese family had acknowledged that Moretti had been operating improperly and had agreed to his withdrawal from Harlem. When violence subsequently occurred, the Lucchese leadership could not claim that Johnson had attacked one of their men without provocation because they had already effectively disowned Moretti's operations. For Mabel Johnson personally, the response to Moretti's disrespect confirmed that her brother's power protected her and that public insults would trigger devastating consequences. Mabel continued living quietly in Harlem, continuing her work as a seamstress and her church attendance. To establish operations in Harlem, or who to establish operations in Harlem, or who might be tempted to treat Harlem residents with disrespect, Moretti's fate served as a cautionary example. The systematic destruction of his operations, followed by the violence that left him blind, demonstrated that disrespect toward residents, especially toward family members of powerful figures, would trigger responses that were both professionally devastating and personally catastrophic. For residents of Harlem who had witnessed Moretti's disrespect toward Mabel on that April evening, the eventual resolution reinforced their understanding that Johnson protected the community and that outsiders who showed contempt would face consequences. The fact that the response had taken weeks rather than hours demonstrated patience and planning rather than impulsive anger, which strengthened respect for Johnson's leadership. The case illustrated principles that characterized Johnson's approach to serious violations. The response to Moretti's disrespect had been systematic and comprehensive. Investigation to understand the full situation, multiple forms of pressure operating simultaneously, involvement of proper authorities when possible, isolation of the target, and violence as a final component rather than the initial reaction. This approach was more sophisticated and more effective than immediate retaliation would have been. But the careful timing demonstrated strategic understanding. Johnson had not ordered violence against Moretti until after destroying his operations, damaging his reputation, and creating official distance between Moretti and the Lucchese family. By the time violence occurred, Moretti was isolated and weakened, making retaliation less likely and making the violence itself more devastating, because Moretti had already lost the professional and social supports that might have helped him recover. The focus of the violence on Moretti's eyes carried symbolic significance that was understood throughout the community. Moretti had looked at Mabel with disrespect, examining her in a way that communicated contempt. And the destruction of Moretti's vision served as direct punishment for that disrespectful gaze and as a warning to others that how they looked at Harlem residents, particularly women, particularly family members of powerful figures, had consequences. The story of how Vincent Moretti had publicly disrespected Bumpy Johnson's sister, and how Moretti subsequently lost his operations, his reputation, and his eyesight, became one of many narratives that circulated about Johnson's protection of family and community members. The story emphasized the systematic nature of the response, the multiple weeks of pressure that destroyed Moretti's position before violence occurred, and the permanent consequences that served as warning to others. Whether remembered precisely or embellished through retelling, the narrative captured essential truths about how Johnson understood family honor and consequences. Disrespect toward family members required responses that were both professional and personal. Effective responses combined systematic pressure over time with ultimate violence, if necessary. Violence was most effective when targets were isolated and weakened first. Visible, permanent consequences served as stronger deterrents than temporary punishments. The legacy extended beyond Moretti's individual case. The precedent that disrespecting Johnson's family members would trigger sustained campaigns ending in violence influenced how others approached their interactions in Harlem. On the demonstration that Johnson could coordinate multiple pressure points simultaneously while preparing for violent resolution showed operational sophistication that increased his standing among other crime figures. The permanent nature of Moretti's injuries created a lasting reminder that certain violations carried irreversible consequences. Vincent Moretti lived until 1959, dying at age 58 from complications of alcoholism. During the final 12 years of his life, Moretti never fully recovered from the loss of his vision. Moretti's career in organized crime effectively ended after the attack. He could not perform the functions required of a loan shark or enforce collections without being able to see properly. Moretti survived on small payments from the Lucchese family and on disability assistance. People who knew Moretti in his final years reported that he remained bitter about what had happened but never spoke publicly about who was responsible for his injuries. Mabel Johnson continued living in Harlem until her death in 1961, at age 67. Mabel maintained her quiet life of work and church, and the incident with Moretti in 1947 was never repeated. No one else made the mistake of publicly disrespecting Johnson's sister. Mabel's dignity was protected for the remainder of her life by her brother's reputation and by the understanding that disrespect toward her would trigger catastrophic consequences. The systematic campaign Johnson conducted against Moretti in the spring of 1947, the investigation, the dismantling of operations, the isolation from support, the coordination with organized crime leadership, and then the eventual violence represented an approach to defending family honor that balanced immediate anger with strategic calculation. The response was neither purely emotional nor purely calculated, but combined both elements in ways that achieved multiple objectives simultaneously. This was the reality of how power operated when wielded by people who understood that defending family honor required systematic dismantling of opponents' positions before administering personal punishment, that violence was most effective when targets were isolated and weakened, that visible, permanent consequences served as stronger deterrents than temporary punishments, that patience and planning created more devastating results than impulsive retaliation, and that real power was measured not by the speed of response, but by the completeness of consequences, and not by dramatic immediate confrontation, but by sustained pressure that destroyed opponents professionally and personally, leaving them unable to threaten or disrespect again.